Our next speaker is Professor Imani Perry from Princeton University, whose talk will be on racial narratives and their role in inequality.
Good evening. Just before I begin, I just want to say really briefly that as a black woman, a Southern black woman, an Alabama-born black woman in academia, it is such a particular joy to be here on the evening when Dr. Cole is honored, because she's been such an extraordinary model for us in terms of her brilliance, her leadership, and her extraordinary generosity. So with that, it feels like a special place to be. And I want to talk about the process of challenging stereotypes, beginning with my own expansion of the term in my writing. So stereotypes are sort of fixed and simplified ideas of people based upon membership in an ascriptive group, a group to which you are assigned. And schema, sort of more fleshed out relationship to stereotype, is a pattern or a body of thoughts, right? That are attached to stereotype frequently, a map of people, as it were. And obviously both of these have racial dimensions, and that's part of what we're talking about. And frequently when we think about, okay, so how do we challenge stereotypes? How do we challenge racial schemas and the damage they do? We think about directly confronting them, offering refutations, counterexamples to them. And I want us to think about that as a particularly challenging task that ought to lead us to an expansion of what we mean how we talk about stereotypes. So when we offer refutations, right? So someone offers a stereotype and we offer a counterexample. Two difficulties generally emerge. One is that when people have schema or stereotypes that they have acquired about groups, they tend to, when confronted with new information, and there's lots of research that supports this, they tend to absorb what seems familiar and discard the counterexamples. Right? So they take in what affirms the stereotype that already exists in their imagination. Or, and this is often the case with racialized individuals who are presented as counterexamples, those individuals are marked as exceptions to the rule, different, rather than integrating that person into an analysis of the group that might challenge the operation of stereotype. The other difficulty, of course, with the sort of constant move to counter stereotype is that there's a difficulty embedded in persistently trying to act counter to stereotype, to be non-stereotypical, right? That constrains the imagination, it constrains expression, it makes those who are stereotyped constantly beholden to the stereotype itself, thus in some ways heightening its very meaning. So part of what I did is sort of taking this into account is that I shifted my focus in work from stereotype and schema, although it's always embedded, to talking about racial narratives. And at the very primary level, part of the benefit for me of thinking about racial narratives is that it really allows me to work across disciplines, and my work is really interdisciplinary. I use law, psychology, neuroscience, literature, etc. And what I found is across varying bodies of research, varying texts, is that racial narratives are persistent. They appear repeatedly. They are partners to stereotype and schema, and they do a particularly pernicious kind of work because they don't just give you an idea of how to think about people. They tell you stories. They offer a set of presumptions about how individuals will respond. They shape our rationality when we interact with other people, and thereby offering cues about how we ought to respond, how we will conduct ourselves in response to others. Right? So if we take a common stereotype about African Americans, a contemporary one, African Americans don't value education. Right? And that's held by people across the political spectrum. members of various racial groups, including a significant proportion, this is what research suggests, of African Americans. Now, there's abundant evidence to refute this stereotype. In fact, research indicates that African Americans have some of the highest levels of investment in education across the board. Right? So when I say that frequently, though, when I hear the stereotype and I respond, the response I often get is stereotype-based anecdotes, right? Well, in my neighborhood, nobody, this group of people, da-da-da-da, right? And people trust the anecdote more than the data frequently because it's consistent with their own stereotypes, with their own schema, with their own accounting of the relationship of people in the society. And that's not limited to people with one political perspective or another. So even when I provide data, the stereotype persists. And one of the things that I find really fascinating is that when I have these debates with other African Americans and provide the data, people will sometimes reject it, but then say, but in my family we value education. But other black people don't. But I've never encountered someone who says, a black person who says, in my family we don't value education, right? So it's everybody else but them. Right, and so it's, so to return to the earlier point, right, so people have difficulty absorbing the information that refutes stereotypes. And the stereotypes have racial narratives that attach to them, right? We see it in film, we see it in literature, we see it in news reports, and the stories that we circulate, and all the movies about the kids who refuse to learn until a white savior arrives. And it shapes how educators and employers and police officers, et cetera, respond to children. So for someone like me, I think, so how do we challenge the racial narratives that give people, and people learn things through story. Story is incredibly important. It's part of how we have a bounded rationality, we have a lot of information, we take in some, and we tell stories to organize it. So I think about how do we provide counter-narratives? How do we present narratives that can disrupt the ones that seem to be so powerful? And I think about that as a sort of a robust process. It includes the survey data, but that's not enough. It includes narratives from children themselves with this particular example. It includes various bodies of research, literature, et cetera, with the point being to shift the narrative, to tell a more full story. And part of the reason I find that compelling is that research also suggests that when people have different kinds of stories in their mind, that's when they're best able to control their bigoted responses, right? And that's, I think, really important. Another dimension of my work in terms of challenging racial stereotypes and racial narratives is the interrogation of the terms we use as forms of shorthand, right? So, for example, a term like illegal, a term like criminal, a term like thug, or a term like fatherlessness, right, which appears repeatedly in policy documents. One of the things I think is so interesting is that fatherless appears in policy documents, and I began to sort of do the background research into what it referred to. It doesn't refer actually to children not having fathers. It refers to whether parents live in the same home. So to go back to the point about erasure, right, to render someone absolutely absent by virtue of a domestic arrangement, which domestic arrangements obviously have everything to do with class and access and employment and all sorts of things, is, I think, to my mind, is both an unconscionable erasure, but it also functions to support racial narratives that, in fact, evidence can demonstrate are not true. So there's also a body of research that says, well, but Black and Latino fathers who are non-custodial parents have some of the highest level of participation in child rearing, right, amongst non-custodial parents, for example. But if you've rendered people entirely absent, right, that doesn't even come into view. I'm gonna move, okay. And so just a couple more points in there before I stop, because I know we're short on time. So one of the things that, and those are just two sort of quick examples, but I think just to echo the two previous presentations, I think one of the things to attend to is at the same time as we're talking about stereotypes, positive and negative, that the dynamic relationship between them is always incredibly important. So, I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting is that First Nations people and Africans are often rendered as being part of a past and not present, and African Americans are rendered as being always present with no past, right, to speak of. And this is a dynamic relationship, a relationship that often produces various forms of alienation or disaffection that we have to challenge. That's one piece. And I think as an ethical matter, if we decide to begin with the assumption that all people are decent and hardworking and complex and capable, right? And we interact with each other, particularly those of us who belong to groups that are marginalized and necessarily have to begin to align with each other. If we begin with a presumption that we all have some universal qualities, and we begin to try, and then we move from that assumption to understand, well, how, though, did we get to be in the place that we are now, with such a profoundly unequal and unjust social order in so many different ways that we can actually begin to dismantle all of the stereotypes and narratives that exist in our minds. And just as a final point, to return the question of being exceptionalized, which I assume that that certainly everybody who's on this, who's been on this panel, and many of you have experienced to be the way to incorporate your person outside of stereotype has been to be treated as somehow different from the rest. And I think about our task with respect to that is to engage in critical exceptionalism, to be critical at the very sites of our own advantage and privilege, and to thereby reveal the very things that make that make the fact that we are exceptions possible, but drive us to expand opportunity beyond our particular experiences. Thanks.
As we continue to think through our theme, we now have racial narratives and racial schema to add to our list of terms.